Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Medicine 3.0. I'm Katherine Isaac, physician here at Bionic Health, and today I am chatting with one of our Bionic advisors, Kelly Joniak, and we're excited to talk to you today about the body composition module, which is one of the modules that we offer to our members here at Bionic Health. Kelly, how you doing?
Yes, I'm doing great. How are you? I'm super excited to talk about this. This is my favorite module, just slightly biased about it.
I will say that this is definitely like to me, I almost consider this like an essential module. I wish that not only can we do this for every single member that joins Bionic, but to me, I see it as something that is so informative that it would be useful to have at everyone's annual primary care visit. Like that's
I
how
c-
useful.
couldn't agree more. Yeah, it has so much utility, but we'll dive in, I know, so
Yeah,
I
no,
won't get ahead of myself.
and so I say, like, this is something I wish we could do on every member because, most of our modules are optional. So they are elected by our members which ones they want to choose. But I often do strongly encourage that this one be completed because it gives us such essential information. But let's talk a little bit about what we're talking about with the body composition module because there are different ways to assess body composition. So we use a DEXA scan, and I'm going to allow Kelly kind of share her knowledge about what is a DEXA, what is it assessing, and then some of the other types of tools that exist to assess body composition.
Yeah, so the fancy word for DEXA is dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. So that's just telling us that it's an X-ray, whole body X-ray that we're using to look at three different compartments. So there's two compartment models, there's three compartment models, there's four, all the way up to six. So the DEXA is looking at bone mineral density and bone mineral content. It's looking at fat mass and fat-free mass. So we often associate fat-free mass with muscle mass, which is somewhat true, but fat-free mass also encompasses all your lean soft tissues in your body, including bone. So if we want to separate that, we can also look at lean soft tissue. There's a lot of different components that we can break down a DEXA scan into. Some of the other compartment models that I mentioned, a lot of people will see either at-home scales or gym scales that have what we call a BIA, so it's bioelectrical impedance, and that is having a small amount of electrical current sent through your body. Obviously, you can't feel it, and it's measuring how much the wave is going through. So if you hit fat, it doesn't conduct electricity, so that is how it's estimating fat versus fat-free mass. Because it's two compartment, you're only measuring two things, and that's the fat or fat-free mass. You can't get bone from that. It can estimate visceral adipose tissue like a DEXA does, which is a good benefit of it, but it's missing some of this essential bone mineral density values. Um, and often, especially in research, especially when you're trying to get more precise measurements, we might use a DEXA with a BIA because the BIAs can also get total body water. And there are equations that have been validated that create a four compartment model, which uses the fat-free mass, fat mass, the bone mineral density, and the water content. So you can kind of pick and choose which ones you want to use, and then the six compartment ones aren't used very often because that is where you start to get down into the nitty gritty of minerals and things like that. So that's outside the scope. All of that to say, all these tools can be useful and are valuable, but there's different levels of precision that you might look for or accuracy. So I like to say that the BIA is reliably unreliable, so it's very consistent and it's great for tracking across time. So using that in addition to a DEXA once or twice a year could be a great way to assess body composition, but I still would recommend a DEXA scan over only using a BIA, even if it's just one time per year, because we're missing those bone mineral density values, and those are great to know across time.
Hmm. Great. That's an excellent intro. So, just to back it up for a second, it sounds like the bioimpedance scales. I heard you mention they're
Mhm.
assessing two compartments, and using a little bit more layman's terms, it's assessing like your body fat and muscle using
Mm-hmm.
different calculations.
Yes.
And then a DEXA scan is a three-compartment model, and that's assessing bone, fat, and muscle.
Correct.
And you can actually even use those in combination, which is a really interesting idea for our
Mm-hmm.
members because I do know a number of folks who have bioimpedance scales at home that they use. And then
Yes.
one of the benefits of that being just sort of trends over time. So that's
Mm-hmm.
interesting as well.
And the
Great.
trends from DEXA scans are also incredibly useful. We just don't need to be doing them as often. Like a BIA, you can jump on at any point and utilize. A DEXA obviously is a little bit more costly, and because it is an X-ray, there's a small amount of radiation that's emitted. It's the same as going to the dentist or traveling on a long flight. So the total amount you just have to keep in check throughout time. So that's why we're not doing it like every single month, but more so up to 4 times a year is generally recommended to be safe.
Got it. Okay, excellent. So it sounds like you mentioned some of the drawbacks of the DEXA scan. It's a
Mm-hmm.
bit more costly than having your own bioimpedance scale at home,
Mm-hmm.
and there is a small dose of radiation. And can you reiterate what is like the drawback of the bioimpedance scale, other than the fact that it doesn't include the compartment of bone and bone
Mm-hmm.
assessment?
Yeah, like I said before, it's considered to be reliably unreliable, so it's very consistent in its values, but for some people it might not match what the DEXA values are showing, and that's normal, and sometimes they will. So there's a little bit more variability in that sense, but there's still a lot of utility that comes from it as well. So, like I said, the long-term tracking, being able to use it more, it is less expensive, and a lot of them are transportable. So if you're working with a large group of people, you can move them around, whereas a DEXA is pretty much set in stone.
Yeah. Actually, that's a good point. So, in terms of precision with DEXA scans as well, in general, it's a good idea to get your DEXA scan repeatedly on the same machine. Is that correct?
Yeah, on the same type of machine and the same machine itself whenever possible.
Hmm.
With every measurement, they're all estimates, so it's not going to be exact. One of my mentors used to joke around and say that the gold standard for body composition is murder, and you peel someone like an orange, essentially measure every single thing, and that's where actually all these equations come from. They used
Cadavers?
cadavers, thank you, to weigh everything, and then all of the different density equations and so on are based off of these cadavers. So there's always room for error. I'd have to double check, but I think the error for most exos is between 1 to 4%. So that's something to keep in mind. So that's why we also look at percent changes at Bionic. We don't just look at the absolute values because we like to see where you fall from your previous one, the percentile that you're in based on your age and sex, but also what's your percent change, because if it's within a normal range, yes, we might still making progress, but is it as much as we would have liked or reaching your goal ultimately?
Got it. Excellent. So, I have a question, follow-up question to that. So you
Hmm.
talk about like an error of 1 to 4% on repeat body composition with DEXA scan. Is that true for every compartment that we're evaluating? So like if you're looking at fat-free mass index versus VAT, visceral adipose tissue, or does it seem to be that there are certain areas that are more or less reliable on subsequent scans?
That's a great question. I actually don't know the answer to that, but my assumption would be all those values that you're mentioning are based off of the absolute lean soft tissue, for example, and then height, because it's fat-free mass index, for example, is your fat-free mass value divided by height.
Mhm.
So my assumption is that whatever the error is for one affects all of those based on that.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, excellent. So I feel like we've kind of given a nice intro into some of the ways to assess body composition.
Hmm.
There are other ways that are a little bit more difficult or involved or expensive, like you can do MRI and
Hmm.
um, isn't there something with
There's skin fold testing is another tool.
testing?
Yeah, that one is probably the most not well, yeah, most unreliable, I would say, because there's a lot of room for error based on training of the sites. A lot of like schools, for example, will teach their students how to do skin fold testing,
Mhm.
but they're not measuring to the sites correctly. There's actually a group called ISAC, and it's the International Society for Advanced Kinanthropometry. All these terms are so fancy, but that's a group that has taken a lot of time throughout, you know, the world, and they have standardized procedures, and I have found that they're often not utilized as closely as people should be. So you can get Isaac certified. I actually was Isaac certified, it just recently expired, but it's like a weekend long course for 8 hours where you go and learn all these specific locations. And I think it can be really useful, especially, this is more of a sports performance example, but like, for example, if you're working for the Olympics, you might be traveling all over the world and you may need to be doing assessments to estimate body composition
Mhm.
in remote places where you don't have this technology available. So that's not always the case. So if you have access to these other tools, that would be the preferred method, but those other ones do exist.
I think that's a great piece of information for our listeners because they may be going to a gym or something like that
Hmm.
where somebody is offering skin fold testing. So now they can find out if they're Isaac certified.
Hmm.
They're doing their skin fold testing. So that's great.
Yeah, there's also a lot of different sites that can be utilized. So men have different recommendations for a 3 to 4 site measurement versus women might have 3 or 4 other specific ones based on typical body fat distribution differences in males and females.
Hmm.
But there's at least 7 sites that you can use, and even more that you can use into the equation. So more is typically better, and there are some good standardized procedures to utilize. Like if you are outside of a certain percent range, then you retest a site. But there's just a lot of things that go into trying to get the smallest double fold that you can at each location. And like, you can try on yourself, like if you loosen your quad, for example, and then try and get a double fold. For a lot of people, that's going to be really hard, especially if you have a lot of muscle mass in your lower body. It makes it even harder. So, those are some drawbacks that stand in the way. And then comfort, too. I mean, it's
Is it
not,
uncomfortable? I've never actually had skin fold testing. So.
well, there's the actual physical. It shouldn't hurt if someone's doing it right. There are some areas that might hurt a little bit more than others, like the biceps also doesn't usually feel the greatest, and then the thigh. But even comfortability of having someone pinching your skin all over your body, it's not always the most comfortable for a lot of people, and you do have to wear more form-fitting clothing. So that's just something to be able to access the sites because they're all over.
That makes sense.
Yes, but there's a part of the training is being really conscious of that. A lot of times you have to do circumference measurements, like around the waist and the hips. So there's a lot of different techniques that you can use to make sure you're not getting like too close to someone, and like the side and the angle that you are measuring is an important consideration. So someone that is well trained is going to have that as a top of mind approach when they're doing these measurements.
Okay, good to know. Excellent. All
Yes.
right. So we talked a bit about different types of body composition. Let's
Hmm.
talk a little bit more about DEXA scan and the types of measurements that are collected that
Hmm.
people can begin to familiarize themselves with the terms. Before coming to Bionic, I had never had a body composition, so I really had to kind of bring my beginner's mind to it all and start to like learn about the different terms. So yeah, tell us a little bit about that, Kelly.
Hmm. Absolutely. So the big ones that most people are familiar with, we've already mentioned a little bit. So you have muscle mass, which is your lean soft tissue, and then we have fat mass. We can get obviously body fat percentage off of these values. Visceral adipose tissue, or VAT, is going to be the fat that's surrounding your organs. A lot of times people, like, we don't want to have it be 0 because that is pretty low and might be an indicator of underfueling. This is fat that is healthy at the right levels. In excess, it's a little bit more concerning, but we need it for normal hormone production, to protect the organs, for energy production. So there is a lot of benefit. A good rule of thumb is to be less than 3 pounds of that is good, less than 1 pound is great. Um, anywhere between the 3 plus, we are a little bit more concerned about dietary habits. So potentially things like alcohol consumption. So one way to approach decreasing that would be to decrease alcohol consumption, saturated fat intake, of course. And then also on the exercise front, high intensity interval training or HIIT training is really valuable for trying to help target these areas. In general, it's pretty hard to target specific areas of the body to decrease body fat. It doesn't really work like that, but research has shown that that does decrease from HIIT training. So that's one thing that we often recommend for people. Um,
Let's pause there for a second just
mhm,
to recap. So one of the important things that we like to educate our members about and with body composition is we're looking at this fat compartment when we talk
mhm,
about visceral fat or visceral adipose tissue. This is a compartment of fat that we cannot see by looking at you.
mhm,
We can't really get a good assessment of this compartment in particular. And this is
mhm,
important because, as Kelly was just saying, when people have higher amounts of visceral fat, it puts you at increased risk for chronic diseases like diabetes and increased risk of cardiovascular disease and even increased risk of cancer. So, the best kind of assessment we have, like if you were to walk into your doctor's office, is that we can, measure your waistline and we can think about your BMI. But really, we don't have a great idea of assessing or a great way to assess visceral fat
mhm,
in the office without these specialized tools. So, when you do body composition DEXA scan, you're really able to identify how much fat is sitting there. And as Kelly was mentioning, there's certain thresholds, but
mhm,
we compare your value to the population in general. So when you're doing your DEXA scan, you can see, all right, I have, 1 pound of visceral adipose tissue, and this puts me in the, let's say, 20th percentile compared to the population of people of my um, sex. So, females in this age group. And that is useful information to help me understand my absolute amount of visceral fat and then also how it compares to women in my age group. Is that correct, Kelly?
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great description.
Yeah, so this is important because I think, especially what we see with our members is if they've never had a body composition DEXA scan before, they're seeing that they have fat sitting in areas that they were
Mhm,
not aware of. And this also gives us a cue to look for additional things like, are they at risk for fatty liver? So I've been able to utilize this information to help me do an assessment for fatty liver. I'll calculate something called the FIB4 score, which actually uses serum biomarkers to give me an idea if a person is at risk for fatty liver or scarring from fatty liver. And this has been a useful tool to identify some people who've never had a diagnosis of fatty liver before, simply because we've done the DEXA and their visceral fat was high. So that, from another medical standpoint, I think is crucially important. So
mhm,
DEXA scans are not only important because we're trying to assess, what's your percent body fat and, like what your cosmetic appearance is going to be, but it's also helpful to identify, are you at risk for these other types of chronic
mhm.
disease?
Yeah, I'm glad that you emphasized that. I think that a lot of times, in general, people get caught up in testing to test or just collecting data, but it's the action and the steps that follow that are the most important and most valuable because you can have all these numbers, but if we're not using this data to tell a story and to create an action plan of steps that people can do to address some of these changes, then we're just doing tests and not actually making progress. So
Yeah.
that's one thing that I think we emphasize a lot here. We try and make simple, actionable items. We don't just take the values and just store them off to the side. Like we're recommending specific actions for people to take, even nutrition recommendations. So
Yeah.
we can estimate your basal metabolic rate off of age, height, and weight. And men and women have different equations for that. But like anything, it's all an estimate. But when we can look at the fat-free mass that someone has from the DEXA scan, there's other equations that we can utilize that might be more accurate based on the individual. So that can help with our nutrition calculations because we're using that basal metabolic rate and your activity to estimate a good calorie range based on your goals. It's also helpful for making sure that you're not under eating, because anytime we never want to eat below our basal metabolic rate, that's where we have hormone disruption and a big slew of negative impacts that in the short term might not be noticeable, but long term is not good for health at all, energy levels, anything like that. So
Yeah,
that's something that we really keep a close eye on with this data as well. And
that's
then some of the other values that you asked about, so bone mineral density, we want to know how strong your bones are essentially. This is great for us to know if someone needs additional scans looking at specific bone mineral density sites. So you can look at the hip specifically, you can look at the spine, for example. So the total body DEXA estimates each of those regions, but if someone has signs of osteopenia or osteoporosis, we might recommend that they go for another type of DEXA scan where we can look at these specific sites. A lot of that can be to under fueling as well, not
yes.
doing enough strength training, not doing enough like plyometrics where that's helping build bone. So those are some other things that I wanted to make sure that we pointed out as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So, with from my perspective, for the DEXA scans, as Kelly mentioned, they're doing a sort of a total calculation. So we get a score how that person's bone compares to an average, which is your T score, and again, we're not looking at specific areas that we look at when we're assessing bone density for people who are at risk for osteopenia or osteoporosis. In those cases, they're doing specific measurements of, as you said, the lumbar spine, the femoral neck, and the femur. And how I've used that clinically is I've had women who are in the perimenopause or menopause period of life. And if their total T score looks concerning, or they also measure a Z score, which is comparison to people in your age range, then that is an indication to do a dedicated bone density scan of the lumbar spine, the femur, and the femoral neck. So that's been a cue for us for a number of times where we then go on to do the specific DEXA and have been able to identify people who have osteopenia and osteoporosis. And I think this is particularly interesting, especially for women who are perimenopausal and menopausal, because one of the things that we know can happen is that there's a shift in body composition. They tend to have more weight gain around the middle, less muscle mass. They can have increased visceral fat, and they can also have bone loss. So, doing a DEXA scan like this body composition has been able to help us identify some people at risk. And what I was going to say was that oftentimes women in the perimenopausal, menopausal phase, when they're faced with this weight gain, they start to restrict. They start to do caloric restriction without thinking about the benefits of weight training and getting enough protein to help support muscle growth. And they're trying to restrict to keep the body weight down. But in actuality, what happens is they have loss of muscle and loss of bone density. And that could be problematic. It compounds the issue because they're
Mm-hmm.
already at risk for losing bone mass at this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. This is definitely a group that, well, I am also a little bit biased on because my research lab focused heavily on perimenopause as a population that we studied because they're so under-researched. But this is definitely a group that's at risk, especially in general. I think it's well known that most of the time females are told not to lift heavy weights and to do more reps, and that's bad because they're going to be bulky and whatnot, but that's not the case, and it's actually doing a long-term disservice to them because we need to start increasing bone when we're young and then maintain that throughout our life because it's really hard. It takes a number of months to years to even grow bone. So the diet is really important. Having enough proteins, there's amino acids available. Obviously, vitamin D intake is important as well. So those are just some short things that we pay attention to, especially for this group, but for people in general because the turnover time is pretty slow.
Yeah, excellent. And it's also interesting just thinking about hormone health for our members. I have also identified members who have had testosterone deficiency, or male hypogonadism is the clinical term, and we're identifying that as they're coming to us. And as such, on their body composition, we can actually see that their bone density is falling in a lower percentile than we would expect for that
Hmm.
their age group. And again, we look at their Z scores and make sure that they're not actually truly osteopenic or osteoporotic. But
Hmm.
this is something that wouldn't have been identified had they not had this additional testing. So it's interesting because coming from the world or of primary care before coming to Bionic, that was not something I was typically on my radar,
Hmm.
picking up and identifying men who are at risk. So I think we're definitely being proactive in a way that
Hmm.
you don't normally have the tools to be. So that's great.
Hmm. Yeah, I also wanted to draw attention to one other aspect. I know a lot of times we talk about females as being a little bit more restrictive in their diet to impact body composition and weight, but we also find a lot of males doing the exact same thing because that's what's popular in the media. Or, of course, if you're going to decrease carbs or decrease total food, that's going to have an impact. But it's that balance of like, what is a safe and healthy, effective way to reach your goal versus what's an extreme side of it that's going to potentially cause these hormonal disruptions and long-term negative impacts, loss of muscle mass. I think, to emphasize the muscle mass side of things, we definitely want to accrue as much as possible when we're younger once again. And you can do this at any point. It's a lot easier to build muscle than bone. But as we age, we start to decrease absorption of amino acids, so protein. So making sure, I know it's hard for people to get a lot of protein into their diet, but making a concerted effort to increase it is going to be really impactful for the bone and the muscle mass. And it's going to help with a lot of these weight loss goals because it's going to increase feelings of fullness. So that's going to help with not wanting to maybe reach for that other snack because you're already going to be full, and having these amino acids available to help with recovery from exercise, for example. I also find that a lot of people just try and keep exercising, but it really comes down to fueling your body properly. And if you're not doing that, you're not really capitalizing as much on these training sessions as you might think that you are. So they both go hand in hand. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. There's one thing we mentioned earlier, which I was hoping that we can just clarify just for our members, especially people who have never had body composition.
Mm-hmm.
Like a simple concept, but just the concept of percent body fat and how that's calculated, and
Mm-hmm.
how as you shift your composition, that actually shifts your percent body fat. So I think
Yeah.
people think I just have to lose fat. So that we can
Right.
talk
Yeah,
about.
I'm really glad you brought that up because obviously a lot of language that we hear in the media, but also with members, is, well, I just want to lose weight. And I like to try and take a moment to emphasize that the weight is just a number. Yes, there's BMIs out there that might give an indication of where you fall, but even those aren't reliable, especially when you have someone that has a lot of muscle mass. You might be seen as overweight or whatnot, but it's not accounting for the composition. So we always talk about composition, and a lot of times we ask people to clarify, well, is your goal recomposition? And this is where we might be shifting some of this fat mass to fat-free mass. So that's an important difference that I like to emphasize for people and kind of change the mindset around. So if we are changing either the diet or the exercise, your weight might start to increase, but you might be gaining muscle. And that's where it's helpful to have these tools to track changes over time. Because, like you're saying, we might see this shift where either your weight might stay the same or it might increase, but we might be accruing muscle and decreasing fat, which will automatically lower your body fat percentage. So that is just looking at how much fat divided by weight that you have. So we like to focus on muscle, especially because functionally, quality of life, especially in older adults, is based a lot on lower body muscle mass. So being able to remain independent in your life, being able to stand up out of a chair, sit down on your own, simple things like that, we don't think about when we're younger, but being able to have all this muscle mass accrued helps down the line with those things and remain keeping that independence long term.
Yeah, that's great. So as you begin to work on body recomposition and you're building muscle, even if your fat mass stays the same, your body fat percentage is going to decrease because you're
Hmm.
increasing that
Right.
denominator. So that's super important. And, we're working on a combination. So certainly if people have high visceral adipose tissue, yes, we're going to want to get fat mass down.
Hmm.
There was something else I wanted to mention about muscle mass. Oh, yes. One of the things, and this is a little bit more nuanced, but even with the DEXA scan, we can't be 100% perfect when we're assessing muscle mass. So within the muscle itself, there is some fat that sits in there. So sometimes, especially if you have someone who really needs to be getting the weight down and hasn't been doing any kind of training, there may be like an overestimation of their fat-free mass and their appendicular lean mass. Which, as they begin to do body recomposition, they see that trend down initially as they're getting some of the fat mass off. So,
Hmm.
just wanted to point that out too.
Yeah, excellent.
All right, so let's see. We talked about the three different compartments. You gave a nice overview of resting metabolic rate. Um, and I think just in general, you talked about intervals of assessing body composition. So
Hmm.
you mentioned, every 3 months as the shortest interval. And typically at Bionic, we're looking at every 6 months or so for reassessment of body
Hmm.
composition.
Yes, yeah. So especially with Bionic, we're focused on longevity. So long term, not everything's going to happen all at once. So we want the small action steps that are going to help you get to your bigger goal, and we also want to see long term change. It doesn't have to be like the next DEXA scan is not going to be perfect, and it probably shouldn't be if we're going things at a nice steady state. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. I think there's a big push to have change right away, but it does take time, especially based on what you've been doing for all the years beforehand. It might take even longer. So just patience and consistency are the key to everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that.
And knowing that it's not linear, sorry to cut you off, but I think we often hear people look at progress as like a straight line. I think I just mentioned it in another podcast, but it's all over the place. Sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. Sometimes there's life events or stressors that, of course, you didn't see coming, and that might impact things. So, not beating yourself up over that and celebrating the little wins. Even at Bionic, we celebrate member wins every week because we like to draw attention to that and keep having that positive energy supporting our members at all times, and we don't want any even considered small win to go unnoticed because all those things are actually big things that just look small.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that. That's super true. And I think of it even in my own journey at Bionic. I'm happy to say I had increase in muscle mass on my repeat body composition. So I was super thrilled about that. But kind of going through exactly what you were talking about, where through a combination of factors, busy at home, busy at work, the weather not being great, I felt like I hadn't been weight training as much as I was liking, or much that I needed to, and was worried about kind of losing the momentum and the gains that I had made. But it's just about
Hmm.
consistency and getting back on track. And
And environment. I mean, you're lucky to work in a place where that's our main focus. So everyone in the office kind of has that, not in an overwhelming, like, oh, shame on you for not doing this or for having a slice of the amazing sourdough bread we have in the office. No, it's a celebration of all the efforts over time, but also maintaining those little enjoyments. Like food, for example, is meant to be enjoyable. So it's not a negative, it's a very positive environment that we create around food and exercise, and support. I think that's the key. So building a strong community whenever you can, even if it's just a partner at home or even getting kids involved, is another great way to help just maintain the
yeah,
changes that you want to make.
I was as you were talking about that, I was thinking like a community of consistency who values consistency rather than the absolutes, like,
Hmm.
what is my body fat percentage, or how much am I lifting. Yes, those are all good important goals that we may have, but I think if at top of mind you have that value of consistency, um,
Hmm.
and kind of getting back on track if you've fallen off, I think is the most important thing that you can have around you. So hopefully, finding ways to create that for yourself would
Hmm.
be super important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that that's kind of undervalued a little bit in our society these days. Like we're kind of a lot of us are focused, not intentionally, but it's on like individual and not on the community as a whole. And it works both ways. It benefits others, but in turn, it also benefits you. So even if you're nervous about starting weightlifting or something, like going to a group class or having a personal trainer, someone that's going to be in your corner or doing it with your family, something that's going to cultivate this can be super, super helpful for not only maintaining the goals or consistency, but also for reaching your goals. And it's fun. It's something you get to look forward to. For example, for me, I used to train with my weightlifting team, and that was always great because you have this community around you, they're cheering for you. And then I left and had to move for school, and I was training alone, and that was really hard for a while until you build a new community at your new location.
I think it's important for us to share like where even we have interruptions to our schedule or things that are difficult. And as you were talking, I was thinking about how both you and I have had to add physical therapy
Hmm.
in for our training. And that was also a hindrance for me because I had injured my shoulders as I started doing weight training because I had never
Hmm.
done weight training before. And as I was escalating my weight, I started to notice symptoms of the injury and had to scale back on that, which was disappointing because I felt like, oh, wow, here I am, first time I bought the weights, and now 2 weeks after I bring these heavier weights home, I have to stop and I have to pause. Um,
Hmm.
but training the mindset has been, I think, really an additional skill that I've been developing during this time, and I see that as super valuable because mindset is really what's going to help you to achieve your goal,
Hmm.
whatever area of your life. So
Right.
if I can have that healthy mindset and train that mindset with my physical training, how can I then utilize that with career or family or etc.
Hmm.
So that's been great.
Um, I think it's kind of goes in line with the cliche. It's not about the destination, it's about the journey, and that is completely true. And I think that's the mind shift that we keep talking about is enjoying the process, finding the things you enjoy to do, knowing that not every exercise is going to be your favorite, not every session is going to be your favorite, but starting to see, I guess, like the way that you can challenge yourself and push yourself. The One of my previous mentors, coaches, I'd say, his name was Clyde Emmerich, and he was a Olympic weightlifter. He competed in the 1952 Helsinki Olympics. I was one of the last people that he ever got to coach before he passed away, and he always used to tell me that you can always do more than you think you can. And I think that exercise in general, like it is hard. It's not easy. It's not meant to be easy, but you get a lot of self fulfillment, I would say, from being able to push yourself and know that you might be making these changes and reaching your goal, but enjoying the actual moment and the process starts to become more invigorating over time rather than these, you know, values and goals and data points we're trying to reach. It's not always about that.
Yeah, I do get a lot of gratification out of sort of surprising myself and doing more than I actually imagined that I could do, or
Hmm.
stretching myself beyond, the limits of what I thought I could do. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that. I think that that's wonderful. And part of that is it's not about lifting heavier, but rather
Hmm.
continuing to stick with something and be
Yes.
persistent and consistent. So yeah, that's definitely a good reminder for us all. I think that that's great.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, even though it's all supporting these body composition changes in part of this module, everything's connected and we need all the exercise and nutrition with all of these modules, and they're all going to help with the longevity and the goals that people have, but we don't ever want to lose sight of the enjoyable side of it as well. So it's,
Right.
once again, not always about the data and the numbers. They are useful and we need them to help tell the story, but we also need to see how it plays out long term.
Yeah, and you know, uh, similarly, we were talking about the importance of our bionic why, which is our
Hmm.
reason for actually doing what we do or participating with our program. And it's kind of like, why are we investing our time, our energy, our money into doing these things for ourselves? And everyone, it's important to understand your why. So for me, my why is because I want to be strong and active to keep up with my son. And to be able to enjoy being active with him and not say, oh, wait, I've got to stop, or I can't do this. So I love that. That is my reason
Mhm.
for making these changes in my life, and it makes it easier for me. So that's again another important key to being consistent is having a good solid why for
Mhm.
making these changes, getting up an extra half hour early in the morning when it's dark still, and saying, oh,
Mhm.
yes, this is my reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can share one for myself too. So obviously I have a little bit for training wise, I have competition goals. So I like to compete. That's something that I find joy in, but it's not just achieving numbers because I'm having fun doing it, right? But on the other side of things, I look at my mom, for example, and my aunt, and they live very active lifestyles. And they're between the ages of 60 and 70 years old. So seeing that and what they can do compared to other people in their age groups is something that is a motivator for me, and one of my whys for my long-term health and just physical development is that my mom plays pickleball every single day for 3 hours and goes and weight trains. And then my aunt's traveling the world hiking mountains at 70 years old. And that's what I want to be able to do long term. So it's nice to have that as kind of like an inspiration, um, as other people might be struggling to do like a walk around the block, for example.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's such a great example. And shout out to Mama Joniak for doing her thing and being strong, and a great role model for other women out there. So
Absolutely.
all right. Well, thank you, Kelly. This has been an exciting conversation. I think we touched on some really, really important information, not only describing what a body composition DEXA scan is all about and what we're looking for, but also the reasoning why we like to utilize it clinically and how members can get value out of it and use it in terms of supporting their training goals. So this is excellent, and I'm sure we're going to have some more rich conversations in the future. I'm looking forward to the performance podcast that you're going to be doing with Anna. It's
Yes.
also very complementary to what we're talking about today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Medicine 3.0. We make this podcast so that you know where to turn for good information on keeping you and your loved ones healthy. Feel free to check us out at bionichealth.com, where we can help you live a longer, happier life.